Well, when I came back on study leave in '63, one of the things I intended to do was to get on top of Piero Sraffa's Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities, his magnum opus, which he published in 1960, and on which he'd been working for well over 30 years. I met a young Italian-American called Vincent Massaro, who had come to work with Sraffa as well, or on Sraffa. So we agreed that we would read the book, and we would not go on to the next sentence until we persuaded ourselves we'd understood the one we just read. So it took us about a year, and because he spoke fluent Italian, he became very friendly with Piero. Piero was very nice. Piero remembered me from being a research student, and I remember the night of Bob Solo's Marshall lectures and then the party, I had been summoned to Piero's rooms in Trinity in the evening to discuss a paper that Massaro and I had written on aspects of his book. And that was it was a very hot day, and the chap who made the booze for the party had put 3 times as much gin in it as he should have. So we were all completely as tight as ticks. The famous memory of Joan Robinson, who was a great boozer anyway, but could take it. But she was standing there and she'd drunk a lot of this because it was so hot, and she didn't know how potent it was. And then she decided it was time to leave. So she turned round, and she had on her famous Pakistani type pantaloons on, and she momentarily lost her balance. And one leg went up like a right angle, and you could see her tottering like this. And then as a random event, she headed for an opening, and by a fluke, she got through the one door you could go through. Anyway, I'd never had a car before, and I went out to dinner with Robin Matthews and Aubrey Silverstone and a bloke called Harvey Liebenstein, who was also visiting at the time. And then I had to leave to go round to Piero's. So I jumped in our little Ford Prefect. I'd never driven through town before. I went through like Stirling Moss, round corners round into Trinity, and up with Vincent to see Piero. And of course Piero was terrifying in argument. Everyone was petrified of him. He was the one person that Joan was scared of in argument. Anyway, I was so drunk, I came back good as, gave him as good as he got. A great night. And I remember then Vincent and I decided that we would do a review article of the book, and we got Piero to approve it. He approved everything we wrote, and just before we sent it off to be published, or to see if it would be published, we were discussing it with him, and we were discussing one particular point where I thought I found something not was wrong, but it wasn't quite right in the book. And I persuaded Piero that this was so, and also persuaded him that I thought of a way of fixing it up. So we were going through that, and Piero started backtracking. And I said, "But Piero, last time we discussed this, you agreed with me." He lost it completely. His eyebrows hit the ceiling, he screeched at me, "I am not the Pope, I am not infallible." Given his left-wing hatred of the Pope and everything he stood for, that really was something. Anyway, as a result of having to sit in on the debates between Joan and Solo and Arrow, and doing Sraffa's book, which was complementary to Joan's critique. In fact, Joan's critique was complementary to Piero's, actually, on reflection. I wasn't completely on top of what was going on, but I had read all the relevant literature and listened to these people discussing and so on. So when I went home to Adelaide, as well as being in the anti-war movement, I suddenly got this strange rumour that this new journal, the Journal of Economic Literature, had been set up with an editor called Mark Perlman, who'd done his PhD in Melbourne in the 40s, but was the son of a famous the only Jew at Wisconsin, a Labour historian, economist, who was at Pittsburgh. Anyway, he was in Australia visiting when he heard that the person he'd commissioned to write the capital theory survey had pulled out because he thought he would offend his patrons. So Wilfred Prest, my former professor at Melbourne, Alan's older brother, said, well, why don't you ask Geoff Harcourt? He's very good at explaining what other people say, in effect. So Perlman came over, and after a day's hard sell, persuaded me to do, in effect, a Hart and Matthews on the debates on capital theory between Cambridge, Mass and Cambridge, England, which I'd sat in on and knew a lot about, but not really got fully on top of it, and doing Pirot's book. So I got sort of temporary leave from the anti-war movement, locked myself in a secret room, and I usually had my door open so anyone can come in and talk to me, but I closed it and wrote, please only come in if necessary, man at work, which someone tastefully changed to maniac at work. And I got cracking on writing this survey, and I was overwhelmed by it. So what I did was I split it into 5 working papers, which I then circulated to about 30 people, pro and con, the Cambridge, England point of view. You know Joan, Luigi, but also Bob Solo, Jim Merles, Christopher Bliss, who's another King's man, by the way, and lots of other friends I had round the place, got feedback on it. And evidently these papers caused quite a stir. You remember Mario Nuti?
Yes.
Well, his then girlfriend, now his wife, Frances Welsh, was then the economics editor of CUP. And of course I sent it to Mario. He was one of my closest friends here from the 60s. And I like to think it was their bedside reading, because Frances wrote to me and she said, I hear you've been writing these papers and for a survey in the Journal of Economic Literature. How about doing a book for CUP? So, and that's what subsequently happened. Anyway, my publishing this survey really was a life-changing experience for me, because I suddenly became it was just the right time to publish something like that. And it was refereed, I found out, by Samuelson, Arrow and Joe Stiglitz.
Wow.
And someone else. And I got this letter from Ken Arrow, who said he was in at Harvard. He'd moved temporarily from Stanford to Harvard. And he said, may I have your permission to use your brilliant paper for my graduate students at Harvard? So that's one of my favourite possessions, I can tell you. And Samuelson, very magnanimously, I think, said, well, publish it as is. It's a very entertaining and rollicking sort of thing. Stiglitz, I subsequently found out, really slammed it. Anyway, I had all this feedback from the 30 people I'd sent it to, so I fed that in, and it was. I got it in. I did it in about 4 months. I got it in time for the second issue, so it came out in June, I think, of 1969, in the second issue of the Journal of Economic Literature. You know, to well over 30,000 readers. And then I got a Lever Humour exchange fellowship, which took me to Japan for 3 months over a long vac. And the money for that just covered the fares of a man and wife and 4 children of our kids' ages. So I said to Joan Harcourt, well, what about, how'd you like to go to Japan for 3 months? She said, that's all right. So off we went to Tokyo, and I wrote the first draft of the book of the survey in 2 months, nearly killed myself. I worked 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. It was just as the selfish life of a scholar.
Did you see anything of Japan?
Yes, because I went and gave seminars, and the kids were taken care of. They were sent off on the bullet train and taken skiing and so on. But we went to a number of cities. We had a lovely time. We lived in Kugeyama. It's a middle-class suburb in Tokyo, about an hour from Keio. And I used to go in by public transport, and I read avidly on the way in, sometimes economics, but sometimes, Last Exit from Brooklyn, Holroyd's Life of Strachey, which had just come out, and all that went into my book. So anyway, my book was published in 1972, just as we came back to Cambridge in 70.
The book you have here, The Theory of Capital.
That one, yeah. Which just as we came back to, I had a visiting fellowship at Clare Hall, courtesy of Charles Feinstein, the economic historian, who'd been my contemporary as a graduate student, though we weren't unfriendly, but we became best friends in the 60s, mainly on the squash court. We played squash every Saturday, which we look forward to enormously. And so he got me he supported me for a visiting fellowship at Clare Hall. And we came back just as the book was out, and I gave upwards to 50 seminars on it, and I gave a set of lectures to the university on it, and it was
reviewed. I mean, widely reviewed.
It was very widely reviewed. One chap whose book I'd reviewed rather unfavourably slammed it, but and then Joe Stiglitz, whom I'd befriended here. He was sent here in the middle 60s as a graduate student by Solo and Samuelson to learn about the other Cambridge. And Joan Robinson very foolishly stereotyped him as a neoclassical fascist hyena, whereas really he wanted to learn, and he was a dove on Vietnam and very progressive in his politics. Anyway, Joan made very quick judgments of people, often wrong. And but Nicky liked him. And of course Frank Hahn looked after him. Anyway, Joe had the room next to me, and this paper I'd given to the Sraffa research student seminar, I wanted to extend it, but I didn't have the maths for it. I was a very bad mathematician, even though I'd done mathematical economics as an undergraduate. So first of all, I asked Jim Merles, he was a brilliant mathematician, would he? And he said no. I think he had his fingers burnt with doing it for Nicky. There's a famous paper, Caldor Merles, in the Review of Economic Studies. So then I asked Joe, and Joe stuck with it for a week. He said, no, I don't want to do it. So at least I felt I had very good taste for my research assistants. Anyway, I befriended Joe, and I recommended him for research fellowships, and Michael Farrell grabbed him for Keys. And then we kept in touch. He went to New Zealand for his honeymoon. He wanted to come to Australia on the way. But then he was asked to write he then went back to Yale. He had a chair at Yale at the time. And the JPE asked him, Journal of Political Economy, asked him to write a review article, A View from New Haven, of the two Cambridges. So what he did was, he got out the notes he made refereeing my article, and he had a most uncalled for ad hominem attack on Perlman, which he put into this article, into his review article, and he really went to town, and he sent me a copy of the first draft. And I thought, well, I got on the 1st of January. I said, well, thanks very much, Joe. Great New Year's present. So I very foolishly, I think now, went through it with a tooth comb and got a lot of the howlers out of it, including one remark which I really treasure. He said, and some of the jokes are nearly as funny as Harcourt seems to think they are. Because by that time, because of my experience with Dick Downing, I wrote in third person with not a glimpse of humour, but after 10 years I was getting a bit of confidence back, and I'd always crack jokes in lectures and so on. How else are you going to get the students through 50? Anyway, I always like to crack jokes. So I started to put, what I thought were humorous remarks in my articles, and I really went to town in the first draft of this manuscript. And some of the chapter headings, as for example, Destry Caldor writes again, or excuse me, Professor Caldor, but your slippers showing, which was about an article by Passanetti on Nicky. Anyway, Joan Robinson, who was very witty but in an intellectual way, did not approve of my knockabout humour. But by that time I was, kept my own counsel on this. And of course the undergraduates and graduate students loved it, because my survey article was a godsend to that cohort of graduate students who couldn't understand these very, very technical exchanges in the abstruse parts of capital theory. So my writing, which I called a poets for poets account, was, was marvellous for their generals, their exams. So I had lots of fans from that cohort of, and of course, it was the Vietnam War, it was the student revolt. It was exactly the time, and I wrote about the interrelationship of ideology and analysis and how they're intermingled and can't be separated out and so on. And I even had a section saying that was my view that if you plotted the Hawks on Vietnam against where they stood on the capital theory controversies, you would find a very good relationship between, which caused huge offence, but it was true. I said some of the Americans changed their mind when they thought they were going to lose, and that was Bob Solow. He switched and then took a very courageous stand as a dove. But it was a good predictor, I thought, but of course that caused enormous offence of saying something like that. Anyway, that was that was a great time for me in the sense that everyone seemed to know who I was, and I much in demand for seminars and so on, having a lot of fun. But my mother had had a very bad stroke just before we left to come back, so we felt obliged to go home. And so initially we thought, if the kids like Cambridge and there's an opening, we'll stay, because I felt pulled up by my roots, and so did Joan. It was the happiest 3 or 4 years of our life in many ways, because the 60s was the ideal time to be an academic, and be an academic in Cambridge with that marvellous department, a lovely college, and living in Cambridge, and a salary which was more than adequate in those days. So we felt that so we decided we couldn't come back, even though Richard and Joan had set up a job. Really, it had been Piero Sraffa's job looking after graduate students. Piero retired by then. They wanted me to take it, but there was no way I was going to do that, much to their annoyance. So we went home again after this study leave, and then Joan had the bright idea I ought to go to Sussex. I think she had a map of economics departments in England, and blue for the neoclassicals and red for her lot. And she wrote me a letter which said, "They have taken Essex, you take Sussex." But I didn't. Donald Winch wrote to me, and I thought about it, and I said, no, if I go back to the UK to Cambridge, that's the only place I want to go to. And so I stayed on in Adelaide, saw through the end of the Vietnam War, and decided that I would stay in Cambridge with Eric Russell, this other Kingsman who'd become my great friend and mentor, and we'd been through a lot of battles, both political and economics together, particularly on incomes policy in Australia and fighting inflation and the role of the Arbitration Commission. Then he died in 1977 playing squash while I was in Canada, because while I'd been here I'd met Donald Moggridge, who edited with Austin Robinson and Elizabeth Johnson, the Keynes papers, and then he went back to Canada with his partner Susan Howson, who'd been in Wolfson, and they wanted me to go to Canada, to the University of Toronto, in one of their campuses called Scarborough, which we called Scarberia, sort of way out in the sticks. And so they asked me to go there, and I took a term's leave without pay and went over there. And while I was there, Eric died, but they asked me, would I come? And I said, no, I'm not coming. I'm not going to leave Australia. My mother was still alive, but very ill. Very incapacitated. I felt we were obliged to stay there. They said, well, what about coming every year for a term? And I said, no, it's too much. I'll come every 2 years. Because it was a wonderful little department. It had been set up under a man called Laurie Tarshis, who had been to Keynes's lectures. He was in Trinity. He'd come as an affiliated student to Trinity, and he'd gone to Keynes's lectures while Keynes wrote the general theory, and then he did a PhD, which was really an independent discovery of Kalecki's macro theory of distribution, and then Laurie went back to America. He taught at  He fought for the Americans during the Second World War, liberated Rome and found his second wife, Inga, who's still alive, and then wrote the first textbook, which contained Keynesian economics as he learnt it in Keynes's lectures. And it was published in 47, I think, and it was immediately attacked by the far right. They got a woman called Rose Wilder Lane, who was the granddaughter of Little House on the Prairie, and who's that awful man at Buckley, William Buckley Jr., and people like that. They really, and so every department was going to prescribe Laurie's book, and this right-wing mob wrote to every department in America, and they all started to withdraw it. So instead of it being a great success, and it was a brilliant book, it had semi-respectable sales. Next year, Samuelson brought out his famous text and scooped the pool, and he got just the backlash of the right attack, but not nearly as bad. But he taught generations of Americans and all around the world Keynes in a wrong way, really, whereas Laurie taught it straight out of Keynes. And if people had been taught by Laurie's way, when stagflation came, they couldn't have been attacked. Keynesians couldn't have been attacked the way they were at the time and said to be discredited, because how could a Keynes model show that you could have both inflation and rising unemployment at the same time, which you could very easily show from the model in the general theory, but not in the Samuelson model or in the Hicks diagram of IS and LM, which took over the teaching of Keynesian economics. So that was a real tragedy that Laurie's book wasn't the book that everybody went to, and it was Samuelson's.
How do you spell his surname?
Tarshis, Tarshis, like Paul of. Yeah, wonderful man. He's dead now, but Inga's his lovely wife, who's terribly close friends of ours, is still alive. She's well into her 90s. So
you went back to, you were now based in Australia.
I was now based in Australia. Then Eric died, and I was back on. We had long service leave in 1980, which meant that weren't meant to do any work, but so I went to Canada for the first part of 1980 for my second spell there. Had a wonderful time, and I made a friend there, a bloke called John Cohen, who took the place in my life that Eric had. We just gelled, and he used to drive me out to Scarberia, so we had endless discussions out there. We went running every day. We were just extraordinarily close friends. Wonderful bloke. He was an economic historian, he was a Berkeley graduate, taught at Yale, and then came to Toronto, and specialised in Italian monetary history during the interwar years, but also wrote a famous paper with a man called Martin Weitzman, who's now, I think, at Harvard or MIT, on a Marxist theory of the enclosure movement, which made a great splash at the time. And then I came to England, or we came to England with most of the kids in the second half of 1980. And as soon as I hit Cambridge, I suddenly became incredibly alive again. And they just started the MPhil, and they had to write dissertations over the VAC. And none of the regulars were there, they'd all shot off. So I virtually supervised all the MPhil dissertations, amongst these Italian students mainly. And then a lectureship came up. Mario Nuti left, that's right. He went back to, either went to Birmingham or went back to Italy permanently and resigned his fellowship here. And so they advertised a job. Now, in the late 70s, Robert Neild had asked me to apply for a post here, and that was before Eric had died, and he only gave me 24 hours to think about it, so I had a go, but I ran into, it was a lectureship, that's right, Michael Farrell had died, and they wanted to appoint someone to a lectureship but quickly promote him to a readership, was how they put it. So Robert, on behalf of the left, because Cambridge has always been split into factions. I say that the faculty has changed over its time, but it's had one constant. We're all bantam cocks on a dunghill fighting for our own position, and we define consensus as agreeing with what I just said. So I put in an application, but the Hahn was the theorist on the committee, and then there was Redaway and Charles Feinstein, who were both very close mates of mine. But what happened was that Hahn, they said they had to lean to Hahn as the theorist as to who should be appointed, but also the left had rather left me high and dry as well. Oh no, wait a minute, that's not right. No, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the irony of it, this is the irony, and it has to do with another King's man, is that I'd always told Charles Feinstein, who's my best mate from the 60s, you must appoint Mervyn King. He's incredibly bright. He's very, very good. Oh no, says Charles, I don't think much of him. Anyway, guess who got the job that I applied for? Mervyn King, which I was really delighted about for Mervyn, but a bit cheesed as far as I was.
He later became
the governor of the Bank of England,
yeah.
Yes. And he never took up the post, as it happens. He went off to Birmingham and then went to the LSE and then went into the Bank of England. But they also appointed a bloke called Gene Savin to take Michael Farrell's place in econometrics. So Neild was very embarrassed about this. He said, I've failed you. Well, in a way, I was annoyed that they wouldn't give me back the job that I'd had before, and Ken Beryl, whom I played squash with every Sunday. I told you I was called Radio Harcourt,
yes.
And Ken used me as the sounding board on what the dogs were barking in the faculty while we played squash every Sunday, and then went round to his place in Wilberforce Road for a very nice tea, courtesy of his then wife June. And he told me, well, look, I know you've only taken the job for 3 years, but of course you've got tenure. If you want to stay, we'd love to have you. So I thought, well, all I'm asking for is to get back the job I had, 15 years ago or so. 10 years ago. And so I was rather annoyed that they didn't appoint me. I'd used Morris Dobb and Joan Robinson, I think, as referees. Morris was...
What was Morris Dobb like?
Well, he was the perfect English... Oh, yes, a Stalinist, actually. But he was the perfect English gentleman, the most wonderful scholar. And you really were reluctant to ask him anything because he was so kind and it was all done in his own handwriting. And he and Joan didn't get on at all. She said he was a schizophrenic, Marshall by day and Marx by night. And he thought that she was a wishy-washy liberal, lefty liberal.
Was he a friend of R.H. Tawney?
That I don't know, but he and Straffer were very close friends.
Did you know Tawney at all?
Yeah, I heard him talk once in Melbourne after he'd retired, and John Lenose, who'd been my economic history teacher at Melbourne, had him out. And I was enthralled. I've never heard such a splendid lecture.
Really?
These rolling sentences, and such a nice old man, I thought, yeah. Well, I took my father along, he thought he was a waffly lefty. And the week before, or a couple of weeks before, we got to hear Sir John Shepherd, who was out there. And of course he did his Churchillian act and so on, and Dad thought he was just the cat's whiskers. But I thought he's a bloody old fraud, actually. But anyway, we leave that in, why not? I'm not alone in thinking that. I knew him quite well because I had lunch with him every day when I first came here in the 50s.
Quite a sweet old man, was he, or not?
No, it was very sad. When he was at the height of his power, he had used it rather ruthlessly, and as he declined, people got their own back on him, and so he was very isolated. And
was he still provost? Or?
No, he just retired as provost, but increasingly as he got older and more doddery and more frail, he was very isolated, whereas Morgan Forster, everybody loved, and so everybody looked after him.
Did you know him?
Yeah, well, in a sense, I met him several times. First time over sewers, and he was jumping up and down like a schoolboy because all the King's Fellows had written a letter to the Times saying, get out, this is a disgrace, but they were waiting to get Richard Kahn to sign. And of course Richard was torn in two because he had a sister in Israel. And so they were leading on Richard to sign, and Morgan thought this was a hoot, and he was telling me all about this. So that's the first time I met him. And then the second time was a very sad occasion, though it has a funny ending. And it's the following. It was when Hill killed himself. Do you remember Keynes's nephew, who was an oceanographer, who'd been a drunk? He's a fellow of King's. He's A.V. Hill and Margaret Keynes's son.
Really?
And anyway...
So Polly Hill's...
brother. Yeah, and anyway, A.V. Hill was a very tough father, destroyed Polly's confidence, and same with this bloke. Always thought he was a failure, though he's a very distinguished oceanographer. Anyway, he shot himself, I think, on Christmas Eve or some time like that, leaving a wife and 4 kids. And I was sitting next to Morgan Forster at high table. He's very down. He said to me, "I hate my fellow countrymen and my college. Here this terrible thing has happened, and they're all walking round with stiff upper lips as though nothing has happened. Why can't we be like the Italians when they let all their emotions hang out and proper expression of grief?" So I sort of tried to calm him down and chatted to him for the rest of dinner. And then I told Piero Sraffa this. Piero said, "What a load of nonsense. It's the Italians who are the hypocrites. I much prefer the way the Brits do it." And then the third time I had a long conversation with Forster was, I said, because he's my favourite novelist, so I said, "Do you mind if we talk about your books?" He said, "No, go be my guest," as it were. So I had a wonderful chat to him about his books, particularly the 2 Italian ones, because they're very democratic, and as he knows, an Australian, that really appeals to me, your democratic side. But I loved his books, even though I think Howard's End has its weaknesses. Like Bob Rowthorne said he thought I would end up like Leonard Blast with all my books falling on top of me, because my study is famous for its untidiness.
I've seen a picture of it, yeah.
Yes. Anyway, so in 1980, yes, I applied for a post here, and of course the faculty in the 70s and then into the 80s, it had incredible left-wing, right-wing brawls, tripos reform, and the so-called left was just about in control of the faculty board and the teaching office due to the institutional arrangements by the university. But not completely in charge. So what they did was they had a compromise. Every time a post came up, they say, "Well, it's your turn and it's our turn next," and they sort of interchanged. And people feel that this meant each side appointing a lot of second raters, but happened to be one of theirs. I mean, interchangeably on this. And there's something in this, not completely.
John Eatle was of the left, was he?
Oh yes, he was a protege. Well, Joan Robinson tended to have a 30-year-old young man who was her favourite, and also the son she never had, in a sense. And John was it for a while.
How did he get his lordship?
Through Kinnock.
Oh.
He was going to be Kinnock's right-hand man when Kinnock became Prime Minister.
Oh.
So the theory of the second best, he was made a lord. But he was very interested in political matters. But he and Adrian Wood, another King's man,
Yes,
had a marvellous man.
Yeah.
They'd been the bright young things of the 60s,
Yeah.
young Mr. Wood and young Mr. Eatwell, and they'd gone to Harvard together.
John Adrian went into the World Bank or something like that.
Yes, then IDS, and now he's a professor at Oxford.
Is he?
Oh yes, yeah, a great man. But Nicky thought he was, thought he was the man to carry on Nicky's flame with his PhD, which turned into 2 very good books, Theory of Pay and Theory of Profits. But then he became interested in development economics, and has been very influential. Anyway, they both went to Harvard, but John had been very influenced by Sraffa and Sraffa's attitudes. And Sraffa and Joan didn't completely agree on what was the most significant, well, they didn't agree at all yet on what was the most significant criticism of the conceptual foundations of neoclassical economics. and John, having been Jones' white-haired boy, sided with Sraffa through a man called Pierangelo Garignani, who's Sraffa's executor.
How is that spelled, Garignani?
Garignani, Garegnani. And he again had been one of my contemporaries as a PhD student, and he'd been taken up by Dobb and Piero Sraffa, and he wrote a remarkable PhD thesis called A Problem in the Theory of Distribution from Ricardo to Wicksell, which has never been published in English.
Wicksell?
Wicksell, Wicksell. Did you ever know Richard Goodwin, the wine steward in Peterhouse? Well, Richard was one of the greatest economists I ever met, and he fell foul of MacArthur when he was at Harvard, and so he was a friend of Dick Stone. So Dick said, "Well, come to Cambridge." So he was in Cambridge for 30 years, and he became one of the best abstract painters here. But he was a brilliant, eclectic economist. And I think he was
Peterhouse.
He was at Peterhouse.
So he was with Postham.
Yes, but he was the wine steward for a long time, and he was a great friend of Jones. He greatly admired Joan. He greatly admired Keynes. He'd been a Rhodes Scholar in the 30s and been Harrod's student, but he spent most of his time in Italy and Germany looking at painting because he'd got cum laude, or whatever you call it, at Harvard to get his Rhodes Scholarship. So he thought he'd have fun while he was in Europe, because he came from Newcastle, Indiana. A terribly handsome man, wonderful looking man. A great favourite with the ladies, needless to say, but a member of the Communist Party in the late 30s, because he thought they were the only ones fighting the fascists. And of course he'd seen fascism when he went to Germany and Italy on his painting trips. So then he taught physics during the war at Harvard, and his two patrons were Leontief and Schumpeter. But one of them didn't think he was serious, because when they appointed him, said, "Well, Mr. Goodwin, we want you to teach 8 hours a week, and we'll give you $12,000 a year." He said, "If you don't mind, I'd rather teach 4 hours a week and have $6,000. So this was regarded as very un-American and unserious, because he liked to think as well as paint. Anyway, Dick Stone got him here, and he got a lectureship here, and he ended up a reader. They never made him a professor, which is just ridiculous, but there we are. They never made Piero Sraffa one either. And Dick did a lot of extraordinarily interesting and highly original work, building on the Cambridge foundations. And his most famous paper is one called A Growth Cycle, where he took the prey-predator model of, what's his name? Some biologist whose name escapes me at the moment, to explain fluctuations in the share of profits and income. And profits and wages in income in a sort of Marxian, Keynesian analysis. Yeah, better. So he was a very important influence in the faculty as well. I think he was Luigi's either his examiner or his supervisor for a while, but he's a good friend of Luigi's. Anyway, when he retired, he was the first non-Italian to go in the competition and get a chair at Siena. And he had an incredible metamorphosis there, and wrote his magnum opus, which was a theory of cyclical growth, which I published in a series that I was then doing for Polity Press called Aspects of Political Economy. I got a lot of very good sort of post-Keynesian economists and published their books in this series. Which Tony Giddens, another King's man at the time, was one of the founders of Polity Press, with John Thompson and David Held. Yeah. So, because Tony and I were good mates and been colleagues for a long time. So Dick.
He was in the DAE, wasn't he?
Whom?
Tony.
No, he was a lecturer. The jewel in our crown in the 60s in the faculty were our sociologists.
Yes, they were associated. I mean, they were in the economics faculty.
They were lecturers in the economics. There was Philip Abrahams, who died young, John Goldthorpe, another King's man, David Lockwood, and then John Barnes came back from Australia. And was.
Do you know John?
Oh yes, lovely man. One of the nicest people I know, because he's an anthropologist as well.
We have an interview with him.
Oh, good, because he's got Parkinson's very badly. You know, I went out to see Philistine, who's one of my dearest friends, and they live out at Girton at this old people's home. So I went to see Francis and John as well, and had a lovely natter. What a nice, lovely people. John's always been so extraordinarily kind to me, I must say.
He's a lovely man. Yeah.
So. Very amusing too. Never took himself seriously. Very amusing.
His eyebrows going up and
yeah. But when Hahn came back and all these mathematical economists got stuck in, they didn't want the sociologists around. Oh, there was Jeff Ingham and Gavin Mackenzie, who also a very important part of the faculty and very good teachers. But they all got rolled and went off to SPS. And now we are the Faculty of Economics, not the Faculty of Economics and Politics. Stupid lot. Anyway, so...
a gradual shift, you say, well, quite a sudden shift from a separate Cambridge tradition to one which is part of an American...
Yeah, modelled on the American system. For example, they partly centralised supervision topics. Half of the exams now are problems rather than essays. They teach from textbooks instead of making the students go and read the original articles. You know, and most of they won't appoint their own. A Cambridge PhD is not acceptable.
Really?
No, because I mean, one of my best students, Michelle Badley, is a CETO in Keys, and then Michael Pollitt, who's one of my best undergraduate students from the 80s. I used to teach for Sydney Sussex as well as Jesus.
In relation to the famous...
Oh, I was going to tell you. Remember I was talking about Joan always had a favourite 30-year-old, but the one who's always stayed top in her affections was Brian Pollitt, Harry's son, who's another king. Of course, Brian was another King's man, you know, who was beaten up by the rugger buggers just before his finals. And he was such a controversial figure. There were two schools of thought. One was that he'd organised this so as to get the sympathy vote. The other was that the rugger buggers were real bastards who'd beaten him up. Do you know Brian?
No.
He's a wonderful man. He was married to an Australian, daughter of a very famous lawyer communist, Penny Rolfe. And they were booted out after the Allende regime fell and came as international refugees to Australia, and I got Brian a lectureship for a week.
Booted out of Chile?
Out of Chile. He was teaching in Chile. Penny was researching on charismatic groups in San Diego. Would that be right, in Chile?
No, not San Diego.
No, yeah, one of the Chilean.
San Salvador.
Yeah, which became her PhD here, which got her a research fellowship in Homerton. No, not in Homerton, Hughes Hall. And anyway, I got Brian a lectureship for a year in Adelaide, and Penny went to work with my old Cambridge supervisor, Ron Henderson, who had migrated to Australia and set up the equivalent of a combination of the DAE and the National Institute in Melbourne, and done a wonderful study of poverty in Australia, but also a lot of very good applied work, which suited him fine. He had a very powerful Calvinist conscience, and he felt that he'd been born very rich, and so he could have been a gentleman scholar, but he felt that he had to work like mad and give it back to the people less fortunate than himself. But having been a Dennis Robertson clone, he was very liberal, and my master's degree under Downing was to do a survey of income and saving, a pilot survey of income and saving in Melbourne, And Dick Downing said to me, look, we'll try it out on Ronald Henderson because he's got very complicated finances, and if your questionnaire works on him, it'll work on anyone. So I gave it to Ron, and he filled it in. But he said, you know, if you came to me as a private citizen in Melbourne and asked me to answer these questions, I'd tell you to get lost. This is an invasion of privacy. And then blow me down if he didn't do this survey of poverty, where he asked much more indecisive questions. And moreover, you know, being a Robertson man, he was all into, you know, you can only use monetary policy, you can't use incomes policy or fiscal policy. By the time he got to Australia, he's all for incomes policy, fiscal. He did a complete switch. I used to tease him over that. Anyway, Penny went and worked there, but their marriage broke up tragically. And Brian went back to work with Nove in Glasgow, and where he still is, though he's retired. Subsequently married again, and like, you know, people who marry late a second time, went and had a child, idiot.
Is that to be put on there?
No, I can't understand. Remember Lord Young had a child in his 80s and then promptly died.
Michael,
Yeah, it was a silly man to have done it. I mean, he was a great man. He's one of my heroes, but what a silly thing to do. And Penny married Ian, the senior tutor of Queen's, who was a protege of Raymond Williams, and got rolled by the English faculty in their Brawls there, Ian Wright, who's just died of cancer, poor man. And in fact, the last email I had from him when he was being treated for cancer, he said, there's an extraordinarily intelligent angel doctor who's looking after me. And do you know what her name is? Leonie Harcourt. She's a lovely daughter of my cousin Richard, the bloke who spilt the beans on me when I published this article on anti-Semitism. Yeah. Anyway, that's an aside.
One person I'd really like to, his name hasn't even occurred, well, it occurred once, and that's Friedrich Hayek.
Oh yes.
What are your views of his?
Well, I think he was a very brilliant economist, but in many ways a terrible influence because of his influence on Mrs. Thatcher and other people. But you know that I was interviewed for an hour and a half about Keynes and Hayek in Keynes's rooms here, you know, where Ian, your vice provost had rooms there.
Ian Fenlon.
Yes, yeah, he allowed us to do that, and there was a best-selling 6-hour documentary called The Commanding Heights, done by 2 Americans. And they interviewed me and Skidelsky and Bob Solo on the Keynesian side. But anyway, they did an hour and a half interview with me. I think I got 30 seconds when the thing came out. But that's fair enough, they cut down everyone. But when they showed Friedman or Hayek himself or that, they would say, you can download from the web the entire interview with Professor Friedman. When they came to Bob Skidelsky and me, no. I was furious with them. Yeah. Anyway.
What about Friedman? You mentioned him.
Well, I didn't like Friedman. I think he's an intellectually... to be fair, I've never met him. And people who... I mean, for example, Michael Bordeaux, who's here at the moment, won't hear anything bad spoken. You know, he was his PhD student. Have you met Michael, the Pitt professor? He's in King's. Very nice Canadian who's at Rutgers. But I think Friedman was an incredibly clever man, technically very able, but intellectually dishonest in public debate. And there's been a very interesting article in the New York Review of Books by Paul Krugman making that point, which led Michael Bordeaux to say, that's the pot calling the kettle black, you know, because Krugman's a great, you know, writes twice a week in the New York Times, and has been marvellous in attacking the Iraq War and Bush's economic policy and so on, and also has been selected to write the foreword to a reissue in paperback of the General Theory in America, because the sales have been really down, and so Amanda Hamilton, who's the successor to Tim Farmelow, a very bright, enterprising Australian woman who's an economist, She
Macmillan.
at Macmillan, well, Palgrave Macmillan. She had this bright idea of asking Krugman to write this very
How do you spell his name?
Krugman.
Right.
And you know, he was a J.B. Clark medalist, I think, but certainly he was a young Turk, very, very well known both professionally and now publicly. Anyway, they're reissuing the General Theory in paperback with his very good introduction, actually. Very, very well done, I think. Anyway, so how do we get onto that?
Well, it was a long way around. I asked you about Hayek.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah. I never met...
Right-wing American.
Yes. Yeah, we were talking about Friedman. No, I think he was dishonest and, of course, very influential. No one's ever beaten him in debate, even Bob Rothorn. Do you know this story?
No.
Well, Bob debated with him on the BBC, and the producer was a friend of Bob, so he slipped him everything Friedman was going to do, and even Bob did his homework. Now, if you listened, as an informed person, Bob won, but if you were just tuning in, Friedman wiped the floor with him, and Friedman wiped the floor with Joan Robinson in Australia. Of course, he was a lot younger than she was, but I've had to draw a curtain down over the following statement. You remember I talked about a friend, Keith Frierson, who used to go with Tom Asmakopoulos to Joe's lectures, has been my teacher in Melbourne. He's one of the wittiest men who ever lived. And one of my favourite remarks of Keith was the following. He says, "The proof of the existence of God is the fact that when Milton Friedman sits down, his feet don't touch the ground." And I often use this in seminars, but I feel that a decent time interval should elapse before.
Yes, you put that down. Yes. Well, we've got 5 minutes left for this tape, so it'd be really nice for you to say either what you're working on now, hoping to work on, or something on Joan and part in your life. Or
well, the reason I came back to Cambridge in '82, because Eric had died and I was rather isolated in Australia at the time. Though I loved the department at Adelaide and had great friends there, and but I didn't have hardly any graduate students. I was rather isolated, so the major intellectual reason I came back was to write the history of Joan Robinson and her circle, to show what had survived in it and why it was more valuable in the way in which the profession was going, in my view. So to write the intellectual history of that, and that's what I've been doing ever since I've been back. Though I've been gone off into lots of tracks and lots of other things on the way, of course the other reason was that the cricket team was playing me on matting, and I want to get back on turf. That's now at last I'm writing Joan Robinson and her circle with the woman I most collaborate with, this woman Prue Kerr, who had been my undergraduate in Adelaide and my master's student in Adelaide, and then I was her last supervisor for her PhD here, which was a splendid PhD, one of those PhDs that people know about before it's finished and want to read. So we're working away on that, though, as I said, she's been ill, poor Prue. And when I've done that, I think I'll call it a day. And in fact, Joan, my wife, thinks we must go home in the next 2-3 years. 3 of the 4 kids live in Sydney, and she's worried about when we get decrepit, you've got to be near family. We have our oldest child lives in Rome. She has a reputation for her work on gender and development, and she is coming to a visiting fellowship at Clare Hall in October, 34 years after her father has done that, so that's very exciting.
That rounds it up. But when you say you go home, do you mean you go back to live in Australia?
Yeah, we'll live in Sydney. We've got an apartment there, which Becky, our youngest, has been living in for 3 years, but we said we'd give her 3 or 4 years, but then she must find somewhere of her own. She's a very brilliant drama teacher, and our third child, Tim, who was born here, and is the most Australian of all the kids. He's the chief economist of Austrade. And then Robert, who was Pat Bateson's PhD student, he's a marine biologist at Macquarie. And then Wendy works for the Society for International Development, edits the Journal of Development, and has this reputation for her work on gender and development. and did the first PhD in women's studies at the ANU on the perceptions of women's illness by the medical profession in 19th century Melbourne. Absolute pioneering study. Nobody had ever done it before. Foucault-esque.
Well, I think unless there was anything else you particularly wanted to get in, it's nice to have you ending on a laugh.
Good. Okay, that's fine.
Is that okay?
Yes, sure.
It was a really wonderful interview. Thank you very much indeed, Geoff.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a great privilege to be asked to do it.